Good afternoon and welcome to this online policy dialogue on the Corona Presidency, Testing German Leadership in Europe, organised by the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP's Alfred von Oppenheim Centre for European Policy Studies in cooperation with the European Policy Centre and its Connecting Europe project. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC and I'll be moderating this entirely interactive discussion, which kicks off a DGAP EPC event series on the German EU presidency called Project Presidency, which includes 2 public events, this one and another in December, and a number of joint expert roundtables. And this project will be looking at the key topics on the political agenda during the presidency and discussing Germany's role and the EU's future in this context. And crucially, it aims to connect the policy debates in Berlin and Brussels, which is, in case you're wondering, why, despite the fact that I'm not a German speaker, but I am talking to 3 German speakers, we are conducting this debate in English to bring the worlds of Brussels and Berlin together. And as I said, this is also organised in cooperation with Connecting Europe, which is a joint initiative of the EPC and the Stiftung Mercator, which promotes a transnational approach to European debates and links civil society organisations across Europe with EU decision makers. So let me introduce our panel, and we are very honoured to have with us today Michael Roth, Germany's Minister of State for Europe. Minister, thank you so much for making the time to be with us. Daniela Schwarzer, who is the Director of DGAP, and Janis Emmanouilidis, who is the EPC's Director of Studies. Very quickly, for those of you joining a GoToWebinar session for the first time, as I say, it's going to be totally interactive. I'm going to ask our panel some questions, then I'll come out to all of you. You have 2 ways you can ask a question. If you want to speak, click on the little hand-shaped button on the right-hand side. I will see it, I will unmute you and give you the floor. Or you can write your question. Just click on the enter a question button, write it, and hit enter. But could I ask you, please be brief. Tweet length or less would be great. We have over 650 people watching this webinar. There's going to be a lot of questions, I'm sure. The briefer you are, the more of you I can squeeze in. So that's it for housekeeping. Let's get underway. And Minister, if I could start with you and start with a sort of existential question, if you like. There is much talk of this being a make or break moment for the European Union. It's undoubtedly a huge stress test, but would you go so far as to say it is indeed an issue that the response to which could determine its very survival? How do you see it? How high are the stakes?
Thank you so much, Jackie, for having me, and hello from Berlin to all of you. I very much appreciate to attend this webinar. It's a good opportunity for me to share some views and experiences with you, distinguished experts from all over Europe. I was a bit surprised about the title of the webinar, because EU presidency is team play, but it's not about ruling the European Union for 6 months. So I'm a bit irritated about the term leadership. Germany takes a special leadership for Europe because it's the biggest country. We benefit a lot from the United Europe, and we would like to do our utmost best in order to make this presidency to a success. But without team play, without a close and reliable cooperation with our distinguished partners within the European Union, it won't work. And I also count on you, because without our experts, without a vibrant civil society, it won't work. We would like to discuss about Europe's future, and we don't want to invite just the usual suspects. We would like to invite citizens, the business, the media, the cultural communities, and that's why the incoming presidency is not just important for us in Berlin, it's important for all of us. And we have to face a big challenge. A pandemic is a threat for all of us. The virus doesn't have a passport, it doesn't care national borders, and that makes Europe so valuable in a globalized world. It's a global challenge, it's a European challenge, but we would like to strengthen the link between the recovery initiatives and measures with our main objectives. We would like to do much more for climate. We would like to strengthen the rule of law. We would like to strengthen social cohesion in the European Union, and digitalization is another key point on our political agenda. And we would like to send some positive signals that solidarity is key. We already established a very close cooperation with the next presidencies, with Slovenia and also Portugal, to emphasize that we are unable to solve the problems within 6 months. We need a more mid-term perspective for the European Union, and that's why the cooperation with others is so key. And we already put a very ambitious proposal on the table. The Franco-German cooperation is always under pressure. Many distinguished friends and partners are always unhappy with us. Now we send a signal that we stand united in challenging times, but the presidency is more or less a bridge builder. We are mediators. We don't want to dominate the European Union, and I'm looking forward to receive some questions and critical remarks, and thank you so much for having me again.
And as you say, bridge builders, mediators, your slogan unveiled last week, together making Europe strong again, very much that emphasis, on your logo with the 2 lines endlessly turning but coming together. I know designed for emphasis. Just to say on the title, we are, and as part of this project, talking about Germany's role in Europe. So we wanted to look at leadership really in the context of that mediating role. And one question I'll have for you later really is the degree to which it is an advantage or a disadvantage to have such an influential player in the hot seat right now. But we'll come back to that a little bit later on. Daniela, from your perspective, how crucial a moment is this?
I believe it is a very crucial moment. We are still in the midst of the health crisis, and we are facing an economic crisis which is going to be maybe even deeper than we expect at this point in time. Generally, the forecast is that Europe will lose about 7.5% of its GDP, the European Union economy, which is huge, and that needs to be handled. And so the German presidency faces, in my view, one major challenge. That is combining crisis management with a very long-term outlook on actually enabling transition while we are managing a crisis. And Michael Roth just said that. He spoke about climate goals. I would add digitization. Those are very long-term and very important issues. And the chance for Europe in the second, or the EU in the second half of this year really is to get things right, when both the recovery fund, which is a major financial instrument to ensure cohesion, but also modernization of the European economy and recovery, of course, combining this with the fundamental values that the EU has, democracy and rule of law, as conditions to get money, and then in parallel negotiating the multi-annual financial framework. That's a big task, and it's an extremely political one.
Indeed. And Janis, for you, this moment and the challenge that faces anyone taking the presidency at such a moment, and trying to combine, as Daniela was just saying, and the Minister was indicating, those short-term emergency problems with the longer-term challenges of transition, of long-term recovery. How do you see this moment as they prepare to take the helm?
I think I would agree. It is obviously a crucial moment. It's a key moment in the history of the European Union. I would not go so far as some say that we are finding ourselves in an existential crisis. I don't think that we are now in an existential crisis. Yes, it is a severe challenge. There are some doomsayers who say that it could be this make or break moment you were talking about earlier. But I think it's extremely difficult to make a prognosis about where we're heading to. Daniela was already alluding to the economic consequences of the crisis, and we do not know how severe it will be. We also do not know what the societal consequences of this crisis will be within member states, between countries, the political consequences, also the geopolitical and geoeconomic consequences of this crisis. We cannot really foresee at this present point in time. If things turn really worse, if the most negative scenario would materialize with respect to this crisis, and I'm not saying that it will, but if it would, then actually there would be a danger that the EU would find itself in an existential crisis. Now I think it is about managing the crisis. We're on a good way. We haven't done enough, but we are in a good way, and to avoid the worst of things happening.
Okay. But Minister, you made it clear it's about more than managing the crisis. The other part of the title of this event refers to the Corona Presidency, as it's already been dubbed. But you indicated, and Daniela underlined, that challenge of the short-term, immediate challenge and the longer-term ones. But realistically, is there going to be the political bandwidth to go much beyond getting agreement, if indeed that is possible, on the new proposals that you talked about, the new Commission proposals, which very much in line with the proposals you developed together with France on the multi-annual financial framework and the recovery initiative? Will there be room, for example, for things like migration and asylum and the new pact, another thing that you've emphasized as being important? Just how much can you do at this very critical moment?
First of all, I fully agree with Janis. Europe is certainly at an existential moment, but not in an existential crisis. We have shown in the past weeks that we are willing and able to act substantively. And yes, Europe is slow, but that is the price of democratic processes in 27 member states. And I'm confident we will react up to the scale of the challenge. And more than that, I believe Europe is currently achieving a further leap towards deeper integration. And in these times of crisis, also on the global stage, we have to emphasize that multilateralism, that close, reliable cooperation between states is a forward-looking strategy. It's the best way to act and not just to react. Climate remains on the top of our global agenda, and the rule of law situation is also very close to my heart. At the end, we have to make clear the European Union is first and foremost a union of common values, and not just a single market, not just a currency union. And Jacki, you already mentioned the asylum and migration policy. As an honest broker, we would like to convince our partners that we exchanged all arguments, but now it's time to act. We have to act, we have to decide under quite difficult circumstances, but at the end, this is the only chance that Europe, the European idea, based on solidarity and unity, will survive. So it's not just a technical situation, it's a very, very emotional moment for all of us, and committed Europeans like we have to convince others that European solutions are much better than just a political standstill or national measures. In these times, with the rise of nationalism or populism, it's our duty to make clear that teamwork is much better than just national or measures which are just focused on the national or on the regional level.
Thank you. And just turning to that pressing of pressing priorities, the EU budget and the new recovery initiative, talks to get underway on that very quickly. How confident or not are you that what has been proposed by the Commission, which takes on board a lot of your proposal, and indeed some of the Frugal Four proposal, tries to find that way with a mix of grants and loans. How confident are you that you can get agreement on that? And could you say 2 words about this proposal? Came as a surprise to many in Brussels, particularly because of what was seen as a dramatic shift in the German position on common debt. What lies behind that shift, and should we have been surprised? And then I'll come to you, Daniela and Janis.
It's an extraordinary situation for all of us, and it's not just in our European interest, it's also in our national interest that the countries which are most affected by the crisis have a real chance to overcome the social and the economic problems, and that is the main objective of the recovery program. It's not just a generous gesture to smaller sized or to weaker countries. It's in our common interest, and Germany, as a bridge builder, in a very close cooperation with France, wants to overcome these gaps within the European Union, the North and the South, the East and the West, and that bears our responsibility as one of the biggest countries, but also as the incoming EU presidency. It's a very ambitious proposal. We already introduced some new ideas, which are extremely controversial, but at the end, I'm really optimistic that we have the chance to form a huge consensus within the EU and with 27 member states. At the end, we shouldn't overestimate the role of the so-called frugal force. I was one of the politicians who sent a couple of years ago a very clear message. I'm not convinced that the idea to have 2 groups within the European Union to negotiate the MFM, the future budget of the EU, is a really good idea. Germany traditionally was one of the net payer, belongs to the net payer coalitions, and on the other hand, we have had the friends of the cohesion. My message was always Germany is a net winner and is the biggest net winner in the European Union. Let's overcome this very old-fashioned conflict within the European Union. And the frugal force are the countries which are the core of the old format of the so-called net payer coalition. So we shouldn't overestimate the role of the frugal force.
And indeed, the central issue lies in persuading everyone that their self-interest is also the European interest. But Daniela, a word, if you would, on the cooperation between France and Germany that led to these proposals and then the subsequent Commission proposals, because we've talked a lot about the faltering Franco-German engine in the last few years. And here it came back, and Michael Roth, of course, the Commissioner for Franco-German cooperation, here it came back, it stormed back with these proposals, took everyone somewhat by surprise. Were you surprised, and how significant is this that they came together and made this proposal together?
I think it is very significant because France, first of all, let's look at the bilateral dynamics. In a way, France was waiting for quite a while to get a substantive response to the various proposals that Macron had put forward, even before he was even elected president. And the German view is very different because from the Berlin perspective, there were indeed bits and pieces that have been put forward, but there wasn't this one very big either concept or speech. And so there was this, let's say, disappointed expectations element from the Paris perspective. But then when the crisis hit, I was really struck by 2 things. One is, in a positive way, in the whole catastrophe of the health crisis, of course, and the economic consequences. One thing was that in this crisis, the heads of state and government took a active role far more quickly than in the sovereign debt and banking crisis in 2010. So the recognition that this could turn out to be a very existential moment for the EU, that realization was there far earlier. And despite the dispute that was out there and the inability also of the finance ministers and the heads of state and government to get to one single viewpoint in the beginning, it was important that they spoke and that the various perspectives were surfaced. And now France and Germany, initially it seemed, were on two different sides, because the first French move was with Southern European partners. And I think it is extremely important that the two got together and made a proposal which clearly shows that also the German position has some flexibility and that Germany recognizes the seriousness of the crisis. But I believe that in the EU, three major questions yet still need to be solved. One is the question of timing. And here I believe we have to accept that this crisis continues to require urgent action, and that the recovery fund shouldn't be for the end of this year or maybe the beginning of the next, but that the money will be needed after the summer, basically, as quickly as possible, because if in such a crisis you don't put out the money early, the price for recovery and rescue will be much higher if we wait too long. And the other two elements have already been mentioned, the question of how to spend the money, and there the Franco-German compromise goes far by saying, yes, we need loans, but we also need grants. This is a huge recognition. And then the third question, which in my view is potentially in a long-term perspective, the crucial one when we talk about deepening integration, is where does the money come from? How do we raise the money? And here the idea that the Commission raises the money on the markets is key, is the best way to do this. And then the question is, how is it going to be refunded? And here, and I'm stopping for time reasons, that is the key political question that yet needs to be solved, because one way, of course, would be to introduce European taxes, and that would be a big step forward.
Thank you. And Janis, on this question of can it be done, can you convince the member states that this is a moment to go back to that slogan of togetherness in order to make Europe stronger again? Can it be done on this crucial question? We all know arguments about budgets are the hardest in the EU at the best of times, and these are the worst of times. So do you believe that what the minister is arguing here is an argument that will fly with member states, and that they will quickly, as Daniela points out, come to an agreement?
I don't know how quick they will get to an agreement, but I think that the chances are very high that we will get to an agreement. I think that the proposals which were put on the table now by the Commission, both on the MFF but also on the recovery instrument, is a good proposal. It is trying to bring together different positions. It is obviously reflecting the German-Franco proposal, which was important, that Paris and Berlin could agree even before the Commission came out with its proposals. That in a way laid the ground for the Commission to act. So I think you have a good proposal on the table. Obviously, this will now require tough negotiations within the Council, within the European Council at the top level. This is now going to again become Chefsache, but I think that chances are good to find an agreement. There are still contentious issues with respect to what kind of conditions will be set, what will be the balance between loans and grants, and so there's things which still need to be sorted out, obviously, but I think that there's a good chance that you will get there. In terms of timing, I would argue that the longer you wait, not only might you miss the right moment in terms of the recovery, as Daniela was arguing, but I think also politically, the longer you wait and the worse the situation becomes economically in member states, I think the chances will decrease to find a compromise. So the earlier you try to find a compromise, the better, because if the situation deteriorates economically in member states, if companies close down, if the unemployment rate goes up, finding an agreement might become even more difficult rather than easier.
Thank you. Minister, two questions to you, and then I'll go out to the room. I should have mentioned at the beginning, the Minister unfortunately can only stay with us until 3:30, so I want to make maximum use of the time we have with you. And the first relates to something you've already touched on, and it's the rule of law question. Because we're talking about the MFF and the recovery initiative, and you have underlined that this for you is a top priority. We are awaiting in September the rule of law report, and the MFF discussion includes this strengthening of the link between EU funding and the rule of law. Why for you is this so important? And frankly, the EU has been trying to address this issue for a long time, and yet we've seen the situation get worse. And indeed, Hungary now talking about ending the current emergency, but giving the government the power to impose a new one unilaterally at any time in the future. What can we do to make sure that the EU's response really delivers and upholds those common values that you emphasized are so important as part of this discussion?
Democracy is under pressure and under attack all over the world, and that's of major concern, not just for me, but also for committed Democrats. And that's why we have to highlight that the European Union is a union of values. We stand for democracy, rule of law, independence of judiciary, freedom of the press, respect to ethnic, religious, cultural, and also sexual minority. That's Europe. That's the spirit of Europe. And these are the guiding principles of Europe, not just the single market or a currency like the euro. But what we really need is a mutual understanding of the rule of law. We have to overcome the disputes within the European Union. And it's very, very frustrating for me to accept that some member states are not willing or not able to join us in this mutual understanding. And that's why we would like to introduce or to establish two new instruments. The first one is the rule of law check. And I'm extremely grateful to the European Commission in a close cooperation with us, the incoming presidency. The Commission is going to deliver, to publish for the very first time in Europe history, a rule of law report. And this is the basis for a rule of law dialogue in the Council. And we would like to organize two sessions. The first one is a general debate regarding the rule of law situation in the European Union. And the second one, and this is the delicate one, is a more country-specific discussion on the rule of law. And this is a non-discriminatory measure, instrument, and we would like to treat all EU member states in the same way. And the second instrument is the money. Yes, we would like to strengthen the tie between EU funds and the rule of law. And it's obvious. We would like to invest billions of euro. The EU budget will increase tremendously. And that's why we are obliged to fulfill the obligation. And what I never understood is that we were extremely restrictive to countries with budgetary problems. The Stability and Growth Pact was a very, very restrictive instrument in order to punish member states. And I don't understand why violations regarding rule of law are without any consequences. And I'm glad to say that the vast majority of the European Union member states is convinced that we really have to strengthen the tie between the money on one hand and the rule of law principle on the other hand.
Thank you. Daniela, Janis, I'll come to you in a moment, but I wanted to come to those other guiding principles you talked about, Minister, because you referred to, you said it's not just the single market. And I'm thinking here, though, about the other thing that is coming under some stress, let's put it that way, both the single market and under huge stress, the Schengen zone at the moment. We saw a very uncoordinated entry into this crisis, countries imposing travel bans really without much relation or discussion with each other. The Commission has produced some guidelines, but as we exit from this phase, certainly of COVID-19, do you believe that you as a presidency can help to ensure a more coordinated exit from the crisis. And in terms of the single market, concerns, for example, about state aids and the support that is vital to companies at the moment to get through this. But how do we make sure long term we aren't doing something that undermines the level playing field of the single market? Just a quick thought on those two, if you would. Then I'll come to Daniela and Janis, and then I'll go out to the room because lots of questions are coming in now. Schengen and the single market.
The European Union is a union of freedom, free movement of labor. That's key for us. And without, or with borders, with new borders, new fences, the single market won't work. And I very much appreciate the demonstrations of people in the cross-border regions who demonstrate that they love the European Union without borders, without fences, without border controls. And we need extremely good arguments to introduce strict measures. We already did, and now it's high time to lift the measures and to come back to the Schengen. Schengen is one of the biggest success stories in Europe's history, and it was very moving for me to see that so many people has very emotional feelings to a Europe without borders, without fences, and we have to overcome the current situation as soon as possible. We were all obliged to protect our people. And the pandemic was and still is a huge threat, but the virus doesn't care national borders, and that's why Schengen remain, or the lifting of the measures is one of the key priorities for the incoming German EU presidency. And the single market with borders can't work. And if we would like to improve our economic cooperation for us export-oriented countries, it's key that the single market works without borders, without restrictions, and so we have to come back as soon as possible to a functioning single market, which is a successful story, not just for the business, for the economy, but also for many people.
Okay, Daniela, a reaction to what you've heard, and in terms of how do we make sure that we exit this in a more coordinated way than we went in. As the Minister was indicating, at the time everybody went into this situation, it was urgent, there was no precedent for what happened, but how important is it that we do this in a better way on the way out and that it is coordinated? Do you think we'll get there?
I do think we get there, and I fully agree with the importance of being able to move around in the EU space without borders, without control on people or goods or services or capital. So I think these fundamental freedoms are of key importance and really constitutive for the European project. But I think it's really important to think about what we learned when we saw how quickly borders were pulled up. And in a way, this health crisis was just it followed a pattern we have seen previously. So if you pull down borders and you enable flows across European countries, but you don't install the necessary protection mechanisms, if then a crisis hits, you have to resort to national measures to protect your own citizens. And this is a big learning for health policies in times where we have to assume further pandemics may follow. What the European Union needs is to handle a crisis, a health emergency, in a coordinated European way, to create the necessary transparency, to have the necessary procurement in place, to be able to live solidarity in this moment. And that is much easier if there's proactive European preparation and exchange of information, and then you don't need to pull up national borders to protect your citizens, but you can be far more granular in actually identifying where the problem is and what to do in specific situations. And so I think it's important to get out of this in a very controlled way. In particular, if there's a risk of a second wave of the virus in autumn, which some specialists say there might be, I think a lot of political thinking and work needs to go into preventive measures that Europe doesn't fall back into the previous reaction that we saw at the very beginning of this year.
Thank you. Janis, quick one if you would, because lots and lots of questions coming in.
Yes, I got 3 quick points. One is on the rule of law. I fully agree with Minister Roth that it is extremely positive that the Commission will issue the first annual rule of law report, and that this report will be dealing with all member states. And especially in the context of the crisis, we've seen that restrictions on fundamental principles and fundamental rights were throughout Europe. As a necessity to react to the health challenge. So now monitoring what is happening in individual member states, also with respect to the restrictions which have been imposed, is something I think which provides a chance, because it means you will look at all member states, independent of where they are, including those cases where some governments for a while have gone beyond a certain level. And I think this is a strong argument that we're looking at all member states. Every member state will be evaluated, and then see as to whether some member states have more problems than others. The second point goes with respect to the exit strategy. I was unfortunately not surprised that we went into this crisis in a rather chaotic way. Everyone was doing whatever one thought is the best for his or her country. By the way, even within countries, in federal countries, like in Germany, we've had federal states doing things independently at some stages. So I wasn't surprised about that. But I think that it is unfortunate that with respect to the exit strategy, we are not coordinating enough. I, for a while, have been saying that you need a coordinated European exit strategy. You also need sector-specific exit strategies, like, for example, in the area of tourism. And we're seeing that there are efforts undertaking to get there, but we're also seeing that member states are playing their all ball game, and that they're trying to also find agreements among themselves, even some bilateral agreements. So I think that that is not the right thing to do, but I'm seeing that it is a problem. Now, the last point on the single market. I think here we have what I would call the 50% challenge. We have the fact that if you look at all the state aid which is being provided throughout the European Union, half of that state aid is German state aid. And that is undermining some core elements of the single market. And it is undermining the single market in total. And it's creating also discussion as to whether the single market is performing and can perform in future the things it was performing in the past. And if we undermine the single market, we really have a problem, because this is also at the core of the European Union.
Okay, we haven't yet talked about the international dimension. And of course, the COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated, as we all know, some international tension. We've got a lot of questions coming in about China, so I'm going to lump them all together, if I might. Regarding values and emotional issues, is there a plan to take substantial steps towards a common foreign policy position to China? How will the EU prevent China taking advantage of the crisis by exploiting the weakness of single member states? Another question, what is your expectation for the EU-China summit in Leipzig, particularly in relation to climate ambition and green recovery? Will this summit show the EU members united towards China? Will it be cooperative or reflect a more competitive approach? Will you talk about global health? Will you talk more about a joint push on global climate policy? Lots of different questions there. The German government has called for a robust development of a robust strategy towards China. Minister, your response to all those questions.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and it highlights how crucial it is that the European Union speaks with one single voice, based on a common approach, a very comprehensive approach, a common strategy. And there is room for improvement. It's obvious, and that's why we will organize the so-called leaders meeting with China. It is an extraordinary opportunity for us to make clear that 17+1 Chinese strategy is not a forward-looking one. There's only one chance for us in in a globalized world to cooperate, to speak with one single voice, and it's key with the global in a close contact and dialogue, also critical one, with the key global actors: United States of America, India, Russia, and also China. But China is not just a trade partner, it's also a competitor regarding our values. On one hand, China is a close partner, for instance, in climate. This is on the top of our agenda, but on the other hand, regarding human rights, democracy, individual rights, independence of judiciary, we compete with a system which is extremely far from us and from our values. And is it possible to establish a good, reliable cooperation with and combined with a very frank but also constructive dialogue regarding these values, which are key for us? Without these values, the European Union won't exist. And so, with regards to deliverables, we will push for three things. First, an investment agreement with substantial improvements in market access and level playing field for European companies. Secondly, strong commitments in the fight against climate change. And thirdly, a closer cooperation in third countries, including Africa. That is my expectation to the leaders' conference with China. I hope it will take place, not just virtually, but also physically, maybe in Leipzig or another nice German city. But it's obvious that we are also will discuss about pressing issues like the human rights situation in China.
Daniela, a word on China, if you would, but also more broadly on this growing competition between global powers and this concept very much emphasized also as part of the Franco-German proposal and by the Commission of greater European sovereignty, autarky. Talk what it really means. What in a global context will that push for Europe to be more self-sufficient, more sovereign in technological areas, in economic areas? How will that play in to this broader tension and this competition that we're seeing now between the great powers? We talked about China, but there's also, of course, the US. There's the question of Russia. It's a tough old world out there.
Indeed, and Europe sits squarely in the middle of an escalating conflict between China and the US. And so far, Europeans, and in particular Germans, really tried not to side in this conflict. Although, of course, from an alliance perspective and from a value perspective, we are definitely on the side of the United States. And from the American perspective, Europe very much is a partner and ally of the US when it comes to dealing with China. At least that's the expectation. And now the tougher the competition gets and the higher the expectation gets that also Washington voices vis-a-vis Europe, the more complicated it will be to walk that very thin line of, you know, balancing both sides in a way. And although I said that it's not an equidistance relationship, not at all, Europe, and in particular Germany, has very close economic ties to the benefit of both sides with China and doesn't wish to give that up, of course. Now, for the Leipzig summit, I think one of the challenges actually is not only preparing a substantive agenda with the Chinese in a situation where it's very hard to even hold the preparatory meetings, but on the other hand, also the relationship with the US needs to be taken into account, because the worst result would, of course, be if nothing really much comes out of that summit, but Trump has a story he can tell about the Europeans trying to embrace the Chinese and then use this against Germany or the EU. And I guess this is all about cautious preparation, but then also counting in that Trump is a risk factor here. Maybe he's too occupied with the very sad internal developments in the US but he will be 2 months ahead of an election. And so there is a risk that he continues to instrumentalize foreign policy for domestic goals, as he has done over the past years.
Thank you. Janis, if you'll forgive me, because we only have the Minister for another 15 minutes, and I want to come back to the term that irritates him, leadership, but lots of questions. So I'm going to take a series from the floor, and I'm going to ask you, please, there are so many questions, really brief, 1 minute or less, if you would. Tanya Milewska, you have the floor. I've unmuted you.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question for the minister. I'm from the Macedonian news agency, and I'll take the liberty to ask about enlargement, if you allow me. Under your presidency, North Macedonia expects to to open the accession negotiations with the EU. I would like to know, what is your position? Do you think that there are significant chances that this will happen, or will the pandemic set enlargement aside again? Thank you.
Thank you. And there's also a question, a written question, which asks not only about North Macedonia, but also about Albania. I'm going to take all of these in a row, Minister, and then we'll do quick responses on each. Dora Kastorf. No, you are muted yourself. I'll come back to you, but if you if you put your hand up, make sure you're not self-muted. Klaus Wittmann, you're also muted. No, I can't open you. Palotai Vikoria. Everybody is self-muting at the moment. You need to unself-mute yourselves. Otherwise, I can't give you the floor. Okay, I'm going to take some of the written ones, because at the moment, for some reason, none of those are unmuting. Here's one. Richard Walker is now unmuted. Richard.
Hello, thank you, Jackie. Yeah, just a question for Michael Roth. I mean, just listening to what you said about the upcoming summit, obviously echoing Heiko Maas recently as well, talking about the importance of dialogue. But, you know, many outside observers will kind of listen to what you said about pushing for an investment treaty, which would be very lucrative for European firms, pushing for climate cooperation and also closer cooperation on third countries, including Africa. Where is the price to China for what it's been up to in recent weeks and months in that?
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And just to add a couple more, and then Minister, I'll come to you. Quite a few questions about the Conference on the Future of Europe coming in written. What role will the Conference on the Future of Europe play during your presidency? Just seeing if there was several on the same thing, so this one's rather long. What is the position on the process and the outcome? Are the Council close to getting agreement on the process and treaty change questions, etc.? And the inevitable questions about Brexit. How heavily will it burden the German presidency? I like that way of putting it. And what about the hard Brexit costs? So just to recap: enlargement, North Macedonia, Albania, China and the price, Conference on the Future of Europe, and Brexit questions. So, and all in the space of a couple of minutes.
Thank you, Jackie. I would like to start, if you allow, with the Western Balkan, because it's very close to my heart, and challenging times lies behind us, and I was really unhappy to take into consideration that some member states, distinguished member states, totally underestimate the role of the Western Balkans for peace, stability, for the European Union. So it's in our common interest to stabilize the Western Balkans, and we already offered 2003, 17 years ago, we already offered the EU perspective, and this EU perspective is one of the best tools, and we have to make it to a success. We have to strengthen the visibility of the European Union in the Western Balkans. I'm very glad to say that the European Union is going to provide 3.3 billion euros in order to combat the pandemic and the social and economic consequences in the Western Balkans. We already started accession talks with North Macedonia and with Albania, and it was really hard to convince our partners, because without the political consensus, it wouldn't work. I hope that we can start officially the accession talks with intergovernmental conferences in the German in the German presidency, maybe in autumn, and at the end, I hope that we are much more active in the region. It's of crucial importance. What we really need is to build up a bright future for the younger generation. Without the younger generation, we cannot build a successful path towards the European Union. And that brings me to the Brexit. I'm very concerned that there has been so little progress so far, and my suggestion to our distinguished friends in London is less ideology. Thank you so much, Jackie, and more a pragmatic approach. It's extremely useful. It's not a game. It's a serious negotiation, not just for us, but also for our British friends. And our position is unchanged. We want an ambitious and comprehensive new partnership between the EU and the United Kingdom. And our position continues to be based on the jointly agreed political declaration. And I was really surprised to take notice that our British friends are not really interested to discuss and negotiate with us a close cooperation regarding foreign and security policy. That was also agreed in the political declaration and also in the withdrawal agreement. Time's running out. We have to face an extremely tight political schedule under quite challenging circumstances, and I'm always an optimist, but we have to negotiate with video conference, not always physically, and that makes the negotiations and also the compromises or the compromise building so challenging for both partners. So that brings me
on the future of Europe.
That's also very close to my heart. I can understand why many representatives of civil society are a bit reserved or unhappy with the situation. But the future conference, the inauguration event, should take place in Dubrovnik at the 9th of May. We had to postpone this inauguration event because of the pandemic, but you can count on us. But we have to take into consideration that the priorities for some member states are a bit different. They have to face a serious economic and also social crisis. And that's why abstract discussions are not the key priority for them. But at the end, we have also to discuss the political consequences by the pandemic in such a future conference. And I would like to invite all citizens. That's why we would like to organize it decentralized, not just in Brussels, and we would like to invite not just the usual suspects.
Thank you.
And China, this is my last point. But not just China is important for us. We represent a single market with more than around 450 million people. We stand for stability, for peace, and we have to offer a lot in global negotiations. We're one of the key actors with respect to climate, and that makes the European Union also attractive for China as one of the key players on the global stage. But we have to strengthen our capabilities, and we have to speak with one single voice. That's the only chance to be respected by China or Russia or other.
Thank you. Okay, again, Daniela and Janis, I'm sorry, I'm going to crave your indulgence for a moment because the minister has to go soon, and there are 2 questions I really need to ask him before he goes, and then we will have some time afterwards, I hope, to explore some of these things. But Minister, I want to go back to really where you started when you talked about this is a team game. You don't want to talk about leadership, you want to talk about bridge building and mediating, but nevertheless, Germany is the biggest and most influential member state. Many people saying, thank goodness we have Germany in the hot seat at a time like this, because you need that leadership if you are going to get deals on these very, very difficult issues. Others saying, oh dear, it's a bit unfortunate because if I can put it bluntly, Germany is less than popular in some EU member states, a legacy of the financial and economic crisis and the early stages of this crisis when people, the perceptions, not necessarily the reality, but the perception was negative. So do you believe, and I'm accepting that you don't like the leadership tag, but you are in the hot seat, do you think your position makes it easier to get deals, or it's something you're really going to have to overcome the fact that you are the biggest and most influential player to play that bridge building role that you've underlined so much?
It's a difficult question because we have to accept the reality, and now it's the high time to accept our special responsibility as the incoming EU presidency, and it offers a lot, not just for us, but especially for our friends and partners. And I would like to establish a political climate which regains trust and confidence within the European Union. Without trust and confidence, it wouldn't work. And I would be extremely happy if our partners accept our role as honest brokers, but not just as mediators. We would like to inspire the European Union. I'm not very much in favor of too much pragmatic approaches, because we need also long-term visions, perspectives in these challenging times on the global stage. And I'm not really happy with Europe's role, because there is a huge potential. And that's our obligation. That's also our chance to convince others that European solutions are much better than national measures. And that is my main objective. It would be great if we could emphasize that the European Union is one of the strongest and most reliable defenders of democratic values, of rule of law, of the independence of judiciary and human rights inside the European Union, but also outside the European Union, in a time where democratic values are extremely under attack by nationalists and by populists.
Thank you. Before a concluding question, I do want to give Janis and Daniela a chance to briefly, this question of Germany's role over the next 6 months and how important it is, and this emphasis that the minister is putting, your reaction to that, Janis and Daniela. And then, Minister, I'd like to ask you, just as you leave us, to tell us how you'll judge your own success or failure at the end of the 6 months. But Janis first.
Well, first of all, I think that it is very fortunate that you have a big member state, that you have Germany in this case, running the Council Presidency in the second half of 2020. Now, as Minister Wood said in the beginning, the Council Presidency is only one actor among many. However, if you have a country like Germany in that position at a time like this, so this in a COVID presidency, as you called it in the beginning, I think is crucial. And I think it is positive. But you need more than just being an honest broker, a bridge builder, a mediator. You need to have leadership coming from the German presidency, because you need leadership in these difficult times to steer your way out of the crisis, or steer your way into a phase in which we will be better able to manage the consequences of the crisis. So you need leadership. But leadership is not something which can only come from the German Council Presidency. In the beginning, it was Daniela who was arguing how important the Franco-German relationship is and how important it is that it came forward with strong proposals now. That needs to continue. You need to have an agreement between Paris and Berlin in order to co-lead, and then you need to have all other actors playing ball also.
Thank you. Daniela.
I think we shouldn't be afraid of the term leadership at all, because it doesn't necessarily mean imposing a direction or imposing a solution, but I would define it as bringing the group to work and making sure that the EU 27 realizes all the challenges within the union, but also in its neighborhood and in the world, basically. And I believe Germany has a huge responsibility. And it can't only take a neutral stance. I fully agree that there is a huge normative dimension to the leadership or presidency in the second half of this year. There is a lot that can be settled with regards to democracy and rule of law. The state minister said it all, and I think the important point is it either works in the second half of 2020 and it is enshrined in the financial mechanisms as a principle, or it is not, and we shouldn't lose this opportunity.
Thank you. Minister, I have to let you go, I know, but just in a sentence, if you can. We talk about the importance of Europe emerging stronger and more united, not weaker and more divided at the end of this crisis. And as you said, limit to what you can do in 6 months. But when we get to December, how will you personally judge the measure of success or failure of the presidency? What for you will make you say, yeah, we in that role as bridge builder, mediator, we hear that plea for you to also show that leadership that you are uncomfortable with, but how will you define your own success or failure?
Thank you, Jacki, and I would like to take the opportunity to express my gratitude also to Daniela and to Janis for this outstanding opportunity to discuss the main goals of the incoming EU German presidency. I have the privilege to chair the General Affairs Council meetings. This is the Council of the Ministers for Europe from July to December. And we are not just negotiating the Brexit, the MFF, but also the rule of law. And that is my main objective, to convince my distinguished friends and partners in the council that a rule of law dialogue, a rule of law check is a unique chance for all of us to strengthen Europe, to strengthen our credibility on the global stage. And I hope that I can, in a close cooperation with my friends among the European Union, that I can achieve this goal in the next couple of months.
And on that note, we can't applaud you in the real world. Well, I can do a single, but on behalf of everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister, for your time. Daniela, Janis, don't go. I'd like to pursue a couple of things with you, but thank you for your time. Best of luck.
Thank you so much.
We did have a number of other questions which I couldn't put to you, and comments. We'll send them to you so you can at least see what they were. Thank you very much indeed, Minister, and bye-bye. So, Janis and Daniela, I don't know whether either of you wanted to pick up on some of those earlier questions which I didn't have a chance to come to you about, relating to enlargement. Daniela, did you want to say anything on the enlargement question?
No, I think Germany, well, I think what became clear from what the minister said is that Germany remains committed to pursuing the enlargement process and recognizes, maybe more than other countries, that the accession perspective is key to maintain a transitionary momentum in certain countries. Yeah, I basically don't disagree with Michael Roth at all on those points. But it's good to see that the German government keeps emphasizing this. And there were moments of Franco-German frustration over enlargement as a key theme for the EU, of course, over the past month.
Thank you. And Janis, on the question of the conference on the future of Europe, I mean, what I heard in the minister's answer was, I think when I asked at the beginning about political bandwidth, my sense from his answer was this is one of the things for which there is not quite enough political bandwidth at the moment, or did I read him wrong? What is your feeling about how far we'll get with this during the course of the German presidency?
Well, Minister Roth said it was as close to his heart. So I take that for granted that he will also be pushing in that direction. I think that how we will deal with the lessons learned of this crisis will be decisive. We were discussing about that also in the beginning of our event. So the lessons learned, which means also that the lessons learned is something we need to digest, and we need to take consequences from that. And I see that the Conference on the Future of Europe is a vehicle towards that. I think it is a vehicle where also the German presidency, if it plays it well, can put things on a certain track. What we see is that, yes, in the Council, there's a struggle. The struggle even started before the COVID-19 crisis erupted. There was no agreement among the 27 on the joint position, which is a basis in order to formulate an interinstitutional agreement on how to deal with the Conference on the Future of Europe. Now, there are more immediate concerns, but I think that the German presidency could push, at least in the direction of making sure that there's progress in the Council in order to get also an agreement with the two other institutions, both with respect to the content and with respect to the process. So what actually do we want to discuss in the Conference on the Future of Europe in light of the experience of the COVID-19 crisis? We cannot pretend that we can do that it's business as usual, that we can go back to where we were earlier this year. No, I think that there's a chance to, in light of the crisis, reflect on what does that mean with respect to the conference in terms of the content, what are the issues we want to deal with. And here I bet I have a different position than Minister Roth, who said we don't need abstract debates. Yes, we don't need abstract debates, but I don't see that the Conference on the Future of Europe, which has a strong citizens dimension, but it also has a strong representative dimension, at the end of the day is just about symbolic debates, having debates with citizens. It's about actually making progress, but you need to put that the process on a certain track. And then you obviously also have to find a way how to actually run the show, because in COVID-19 times, especially if you have a strong citizens dimension to the conference, you cannot pretend that you can do the things which you had in mind beforehand if big gatherings are not possible. Yeah. Online, you can do things, but there are limits. But I think the conference is a chance with respect to the future, and I hope that the German presidency will use that opportunity also to be remembered that not only was there concrete progress which was achieved during these 6 months, but also progress with respect to putting things on track towards the longer term future of the European Union.
Okay, thank you very much. There were lots of other questions. There was a question about Ukraine, question about mandatory solidarity as a fundamental part of the Pact on Migration and Asylum, several quite long comments, one expressing deep cynicism about Angela Merkel's motives in making the proposals with France, and is it just a way, the suggestion is, doesn't think she's going to get agreement on it, but this way she changes the image of Germany in Europe. Daniela, I don't know whether you want to comment on what you think was behind the German change of heart and this coming together with France in this way. And again, we come back to Hong Kong and German domestic politics, but we couldn't pick up on all of those. But I don't know whether, as I say, going back to that question of the Franco-German proposal and this change of heart by Germany, I mean, was it driven, do you think, as well by the Karlsruhe judgment? We haven't mentioned it today, but a sense that that was putting Germany in a very difficult position with the rest of Europe, this challenge to the primacy of the European Court of Justice and EU law, which links into rule of law. Was it a genuine sense of unprecedented crisis requires unprecedented response? I mean, I was surprised that the lack of domestic political reaction. Was that because the ground was laid very carefully, or how do you read it?
I think there's a genuine worry about the sustainability of the European Union and the Eurozone. And secondly, there is a very strong national self-interest on the German side to maintain those two, because that's essentially the context of stability that Germany thrives in politically and economically. Our whole economic model is built on an assumption that markets are open. We have the single market as one big marketplace that Germany needs for its own economic success, but then also world markets. And we see the developments globally, which make Europe all the more important. And then there is thirdly, this threat perception that the world is changing around us, and that if we were to fall apart as Europeans, even the largest country, which is Germany, both in terms of population and economically, couldn't possibly play the same role internationally as it can now as part of the European Union. And so I think there are multiple variables around that explain the shift, but I would say it's a genuine recognition that Germany and others really need to invest to pull the whole EU 27 through this momentous economic decline that we will see in the second half of 2020. This is really huge. I mean, it sounds just like a number, 7 to 8% of GDP loss, but this means jobs, this means people on the street, this means, you know, a possible political destabilization, radicalization in some countries. And I agree with what Janis said earlier on. There is a question of when can a deal be struck, and it has to be struck as early as possible in this crisis, not only to cushion the economic effects and to avoid that this also turns into a financial crisis, but secondly, because politically it's hard anyway, but it will get more difficult as the crisis moves on.
Thank you very much. Janis, you wanted to come in, and then I will ask each of you to give me your measure of success or failure.
I just wanted to underline what Daniela said. I think that there's a strong fear factor. There's a fear factor that if things get out of control in terms of the COVID-19 crisis, which is a multiple crisis, it's not only the health dimensions, it's the economic dimension, the political, societal, the international. We discussed about all this. So the fear of things going wrong, I think, is a strong motivating factor to do things which a couple of months, a year ago, would have seemed impossible. So I think that is a strong motivator also in the German debate. Second, not only have we found a German-French agreement, we've seen German-French agreements previously, if you think of Meade, but both sides are pushing to get these agreements implemented. They're putting political capital into this. Somebody raised a question with respect to Angela Merkel. She's now in full crisis mode, and she's trying also to convince others in the European Union of the proposals which the Germans and the French made. I think she's now advocating in favor of what the Commission has proposed, maybe not in every detail, but in general, she's pushing for it. And that means that you have an agreement between Paris and Berlin, which actually in practice is being advocated by both sides very actively. And last but not least, I think there's a big difference between the current crisis and previous crises which we've seen in the past. For example, if you look into the financial crisis or the euro area crisis, which is that this is not a man-made disaster, it's a natural disaster. It is something which has hit all of us. The consequences of this crisis are not symmetric, but it is a symmetric shock given that the crisis, this virus, has hit all member states. And it's not something you can blame someone for. It is something which is external. It came out of nowhere, and now you need a response to it, which is different than when you have a crisis which is man-made, where there's an argument of whose fault is it, who is to blame, and should we or should we not do this or that. I think this makes a big difference comparing this crisis to previous crises which we've seen over the past 10 or 12 years.
So I mentioned at the beginning that this is the launch event, as it were, of your project presidency, that you're going to have a number of joint workshops on key issues between experts, and then another public event in December, and discussing all these topics that we've been talking about, but also this broader question of Germany's role and the EU's future. So when we get to December and the end of project presidency, what for each of you, and I'll come to Janis first this time and give Daniela the very last word. For each of you, what is your measure? If I were to ask you at the end of this year, so did the Corona presidency live up to expectations? How would you judge its success or its failure? Janis and then Daniela.
First of all, I think one needs to be careful not to set the bar too high in terms of the expectations. But I think there are two things which for me will be crucial. One is, and we discussed that in depth, but I need to repeat it, that during the German presidency, and you will need German active leadership, as Daniela also mentioned earlier, leadership is not a negative term, it's a positive term in this context. You need an active leadership from Germany together with France and others to make sure that you get an agreement on the MFF and you get an agreement on Next Generation EU, on the recovery instrument. This is of utmost significance. If we put ourselves into a position where when the German presidency ends, you have not found an agreement on this, this means that the German president has actually failed. So for me, this is key. And I will also repeat that I think in terms of the future prospects for the European Union, the German presidency can leave its mark beyond the 31st of December. And I still believe that the Conference on the Future of Europe is a key in that process, which we will have to undergo while being in crisis and still doing what Daniela said earlier, transition, mixing both of these elements together. And I think this is a vehicle. So MFF agreement on the next generation EU and the recovery instrument, and making sure that the conference makes sense and is being put on track.
Thank you very much. Daniela.
No disagreement on my side. I will just add elements. So why is this whole financial package so important? Because it will be a moment where the EU as a whole, and not only Germany's EU presidency, but really the EU 27 collectively, can demonstrate or not that they have heard the shots and that they understand what the future challenges of the EU are. And that's why I emphasize again, it's both about getting the EU through possibly very rocky month this fall, and at the same time showing a perspective in terms of, yes, where does the money go, but also in terms of political leadership, creating a vision of a future EU, which is a new transitioned EU, economically, but also politically. And I didn't want to avoid your question on the German Constitutional Court earlier on, so I'll pick it up now. I think the Constitutional Court ruling shows us the limits of the current construction of the Eurozone, where far too much responsibility for crisis management went to the European Central Bank. Now, if policymakers take this seriously, they have to recognize that politically, this is a moment where, with the Conference on the Future of Europe on the one hand, but also the discussion about a real fiscal capacity that may be in the creation, there is a moment of truth where, in particular, the Eurozone countries need to go back to the drawing board and think through what is our vision of the setup of a monetary union that economically works, guarantees financial stability, and is acceptable from a legal and democratic perspective. And that's a huge agenda. And I agree with Janis that the future conferences, they are one forum and an important one which should be used to really put big questions onto the table, because I think the system is in a situation, given the external pressure and the internal fragilities, which we all know and can describe in all detail, where a conscious decision has to be made at some point that more solidity and a better functioning, which means technical functioning, but also democratic legitimacy, needs to be introduced.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you both for a fascinating discussion. I wish we'd had longer, but the Minister's agenda becomes more packed with every passing moment. Thank you very much to all of you for your excellent comments and questions. I do apologize, we got to many of them, but there were many more that we didn't. But you have another opportunity, as I mentioned earlier, tomorrow morning, Michael Klaus, who is Germany's permanent representative to the European Union, will be talking at an EPC online event on the presidency's priorities. So maybe you can log in again then and raise some of those more detailed questions with him. And also we will pass on some of your questions were more comments. Perhaps we could pass those on to the Minister's office to at least make sure that he has seen them. But thank you very much to both of you. Thank you to all of you. And may I wish you a very pleasant rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Jackie. Bye-bye.
Bye.